Hey guys, how you doing?
Good.
Good.
All right.
How was breakfast?
Delicious.
Mine was good. I went out with the family, so
Mine was non-existent.
I had oatmeal.
You did. Okay.
I did.
Welcome back to the conversation. Really quickly, let's go around again and introduce ourselves. In all seriousness, let's start with Daniel.
Strongest of pastors. I'm Daniel. I am the
Strongest Avenger.
pastor responsible for worship and prayer here at Christ Community Church.
My name is Jeff. I'm the senior pastor responsible for preaching and teaching and leadership and general excellence. Sorry. Go ahead.
My name is Josh Hoy, and I'm an intern here.
My name is James Peterson. I'm the pastor at Ryrie Chapel, and my responsibilities are everything.
Yeah.
I'm Patrick Murphy, pastor of adult discipleship and outreach, and I'm really excited about it.
Yay.
I'm Ryan Patty, and I oversee our youth and family ministry here.
Right on. Welcome, guys. Okay, chapter 2 of the book. I'm sure you've all read it and had a chance to digest it. And what I want to start with today is kind of his opening question. How has it become possible in our society today for a doctor to face legal prosecution, to face legal action at the suggestion that one's mind, that is their psychiatric state, needs to be brought into alignment with their body? So if a doctor suggests that a person who is suffering with body dysmorphia or thinks that they're a trans, for example, that they need to bring their mental state in alignment with their body, which is what they did, 50, 70 years ago. How is it possible that a doctor that suggests that today, a person who is dealing with or struggling with a psychiatric condition, needs to bring their mental state in alignment with their body to be prosecuted, to face legal action? What are the things in our society that have contributed to that? And so the first thing that he mentions here, it seems to me, is a philosophy. And I think it starts with a philosophy of personhood, which really kind of starts in the teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And also, I would say, while he does not mention this, extends into a philosophy of education. A philosophy of education which is, starting in the 1890s, took over the American education system. So let's start firstly with your impressions of Rousseau's theory. Does anybody feel like they want to kind of summarize his philosophy on personhood or nature?
Well, he says I'm 42. Trueman gives Rousseau describes it as the noble savage. I mean, I don't know if you agree with this definition, but the individual in the pristine state of nature, uncorrupted by the demands of civilized society, with its hypotheses and sharp antithesis between outward behavior and that inner voice of nature, is answerable to no one and free to be himself. So the noble savage is Rousseau's pinnacle point of understanding the human being.
I think that's a really important definition.
Right.
How does that relate to
Yeah. Descartes centered.
Rene Descartes?
Yeah.
Rene Descartes centered he centered. I'm trying to think of the word. How we determine the epistemological reality in the middle of the person. That he tried to falsify. He got to that, I think, therefore I am, by saying, hey, I'm going to doubt everything. And then realized I can't doubt my own thinking, otherwise I have no framework by which to judge anything, which was revolutionary because it moved from an external truth to an internal truth, and set the table for Rousseau.
Yeah. So sorry.
Well, I would say that in addition to that, the main theological idea that comes out of his thinking would be Cartesian dualism. And so the idea that a person is both a mind and a body, and that the mind is an emergent property of the body. And so on Cartesian dualism, the mind is inseparable from the body. And there are believers today who think that when you die, this just is the true story. The true story about mind-body dualism is that your mind stays with your body. That is, your immaterial stays with your material self, right? So how it comes through in theology is through Cartesian dualism, but the Thomistic dualism is the antithesis to that. So it's the idea, St. Thomas Aquinas, who said, yes, it's true that the mind is an emergent property of the body, or the view of simultaneity, that is, when the body is formed, the mind is formed, but also that the mind is separable. The mind is separable. Therefore, your soul is not your body. Your self, your true self, is not your body. So is that wrong, though? I mean, is the idea of mind-body dualism, is that a wrong idea?
I want to say, like, I want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to say both and, in the sense that I think the Bible does distinguish mind, body, soul, really probably soul and body, but that's a different discussion.
It's tripartite, too.
Yeah, but maybe. But it also presents us as whole persons.
Yeah.
You know, we're created as embodied souls, and so I think the Cartesian dualism presses the distinction too much, where it wants to separate them a ton.
Yeah.
Where I think what I would see biblically is that those are to be held together, and there's a reason that with the curse of the fall, that death comes, our bodies are destroyed or die eventually, right? But then, our souls go to be with the Lord. But then the resurrection takes place, right? We have resurrected bodies. And so the idea is that these are to be together rather than separate. And so I think in many ways the one affects the other. Body affects soul, soul affects body.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that definitely is Hebrew theology on mind-body dualism.
Yeah.
Immaterial and material interacting. But the idea, Daniel pointed out that the idea of I think, therefore I am, what are the implications of that?
Yeah. Well, like I said, it centers the filter for truth within the person and not in any external source,
Or at least the primary is internal.
Yeah.
And so, that foundation allows Rousseau to basically say his two main things.
Yeah.
He's going to identify the identity in the inner psychological self of the individual, right? So if you're centering truth, as Daniel said, from Descartes, centering truth in yourself, then whatever you think about yourself, that's your identity, right? Yeah. And then he says, secondly, society or culture exerts a corrupting influence on the self.
Environment,
yeah. So whatever you're thinking about yourself, you're feeling that to be true. That's the truth. And if anybody outside of you, any external truth is telling you something different, that's a corrupting influence.
Yeah, I mean, Rousseau was big on that, especially in his educational theory, which we'll get into in a second. Yeah. The idea is you go from I think, therefore I am, to the mantra, man is born free. That was Rousseau's mantra. And also look inside yourself. If that's true, then you look inside yourself for truth, and also you look inside yourself for goodness by rejecting the doctrine of original sin. And so why is that view problematic, which he definitely did. So why is that view problematic, Pastor James, from a Christian point of view?
I mean, if you, biblically, if you tell people to look within themselves to find their true purpose, meaning, significance, and we biblically understand that the Bible teaches us that we are desperately wicked, then you're looking into a pit of your own despair.
Yeah.
And it will lead to nothing but despair and hopelessness, whereas you try to attempt to understand your created intention without looking at the Creator.
Yeah.
And that's just, biblically, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense.
That's great.
I think it's...
Yeah, it doesn't work.
It's sad, or I don't know, if maybe ironic, I don't know, that, Rousseau is in Geneva, and there's a statue of Rousseau in Geneva, and though there is a small statue tucked away of the reformers, Calvin doesn't take center stage, even though his doctrine is what we need to settle our hearts on and our mind on.
Yeah, that's right. So you mentioned last week the doctrine of total depravity. Can you elucidate that? Do you guys want to chime in and just tell us what did Calvin mean by that doctrine, and what did he not mean? let's start with what it doesn't mean. Anybody want to take a crack at that?
It doesn't mean that every single person is the worst possible version of themselves because of sin.
Yeah,
right?
that's a good answer.
It doesn't mean that, you in and of yourself are the, I don't know how to say it, the worst possible version of yourself.
Yeah.
Sometimes we hear total depravity and we just think, well, no matter what, I'm absolutely horrible, right? And really, I think, well, now I'm going to the positive side, so I'll stop there.
Well, no, you're right about that. I think the way that Calvin put it was, a person is not at once as bad as they could possibly be.
Yeah.
Right, and that is true. So that's the Institutes of Christian Religion, and he held that view until he got to writing his commentary on Romans, in which case he does present a view of a person as corrupt and bad as they could possibly be. So there.
Well, yeah, I would say corrupt and bad, but not in the sense that like.
Nothing left redeemable.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing left redeemable, or I kind of think of more, I guess, the practical. Like, clearly, we're not acting on it,
right,
nonstop.
Nonstop. Yeah.
We're not murdering one another nonstop.
Right.
There's a restraining in some sense, and so that's where I was going. We're not completely animalistic in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Even in that, though, we also, just because individuals are not going out and murdering, the heart is still desperately wicked. And what's the most outrageous claim a sinner can make is that I am right in my own standing.
Yeah.
Correct, yeah.
So when someone says, well, I'm a pretty good person,
Yeah.
that's just as bad
Yeah.
as murdering someone.
Yeah.
Because you're claiming to the holy God that you're good enough.
Yeah.
And
You're
so-
telling him he's a liar.
Yeah, exactly. If you
Which
say you
I
have
would
not
think
sinned,
on
you are a
the
liar.
good and
Yeah.
bad scale would be super bad.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
The example I give to younger people is it's like a rat has gotten onto a pizza
Oh, here comes the pizza.
and has
love it.
and has urinated and defecated
Oh, man.
on every slice of the pizza.
Gross.
That pizza is
That's so
is
nasty.
ruined. Now, are there parts of that pizza that technically you could dig through and find, yes, that would still be edible, yes, but for all intents and purposes,
Yeah.
every component of that pizza has been ruined. Complete or utter depravity would be the pizza is made from rat
Incinerated.
feces.
Can I make an
And that's not true.
It's
Yeah.
total in its expanse of corruption, but it's not total in its depth of the corrupting.
Yeah,
nature.
that's right. So
the
total
depth of corruption.
The doctrine of total depravity. That's a crude analogy, but
My
it's
apologies.
super gross, but actually very effective, because essentially what
Yeah.
you're saying there and what Pat was articulating is that the doctrine of total depravity is that every faculty of the human being has been so thoroughly corrupted by sin
Yeah.
that we could offer nothing. There's nothing that a human being could
incapable of
offer to God that
producing
would be
righteousness.
that would produce righteousness or be acceptable before God. And thus so what are the faculties that have been corrupted in sin? Well, obviously our mental faculties, the way we think. Paul repeatedly says in Romans chapter 1 that our minds have become darkened, like our thinking has become worthless and futile in sin, right? So it's also the physical faculty. Men die and they don't come back. It's also our emotional faculties. This is why we cannot accept Rousseau's teaching that a person is essentially a pure acorn, and all you need to do is plant them into the ground and they will grow into a mighty moral tree. Now, to his credit, he did believe in objective morality.
Right.
yeah.
And he did believe in the existence of the soul. But even though he was an Enlightenment era naturalist, but he did believe that there was an actual nature that a person could conform themselves to, and that it was an objective moral standard. But the key was not to turn them into an environment that inculcates that in them or teaches that in them. The key was to let them naturally explore their own education and their own selves, and to become in touch with their own sort of self, actually, and then they would just naturally grow into whatever their purest nature was, which was essentially good and essentially moral. And this is why the Christian doctrine is averse to this. Now, there are churches that actually teach this. They hold this view of the essential goodness or the essential moralness of the human being. But I would say there is an idea here that our environment does shape our nature. How would that be true? I would say the sinner who is turned loose into a sinful environment or raised in a sinful environment only becomes much more so. Is that right?
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say that a person who is raised in a godly environment where the gospel is preached and the gospel is taught has a better chance of responding to the gospel and responding to the word of God. Environment does matter, in other words. It really does.
Yeah, I think I think of it, we're at church, and I think here you guys are going through New City catechisms with the kids. We're doing it for our whole church. And I use the illustration for catechisms like you're building a fire and you're putting kindling on the fire.
Yeah.
And you put the paper in, you put the kindling on top, you get it all ready, and then you light it, and all that kindling then ignites.
Yeah.
Similarly, our environment can serve as kindling.
Yes.
Catechisms can serve as kindling put on the fire, but the Holy Spirit, by the divine decree of the Almighty, is the one who ignites the flame.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to read a section of this that I thought was particularly funny. On page 41, it says, again, Rousseau expresses this rather neatly in his work, The Social Contract. Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. This is, of course, complete nonsense. Of all creatures on the face of the earth, human beings are born remarkably dependent on others, and that for a remarkably long period of time. Specifically, we are utterly dependent on our parents from birth for some years. No newborn child left alone to its own devices will survive more than a few days at most. One might therefore respond to Rousseau by saying, man is born utterly dependent on others, but everywhere tries to persuade himself that such an obvious fact is actually not true.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's the sort of radical individualism. It's the idea that every institution stands in opposition to my personal self-authority. But if that's true, what are the implications of that? I think he brings this up in that very paragraph or chapter. The implication of that is never-ending strife, because we come into a world with external, not only we come into the world not only being dependent on external realities for our very existence, but also external authorities like parents.
Well, and it's for our good, right? My daughter, if allowed to do everything that she wanted to do, would eat candy and stay awake for the rest of her life. She would die.
Right.
And so there's an authority that I have that is good and loving and tender and careful and and caring for her in saying, no, Clementine, it's time for you to go to bed.
Yes.
And laying that law down. But she perceives it as she's come into conflict with some kind of institutional authority, and it's denying her ability for self-actualization.
And so Rousseau would say the analogy that you just gave is exactly the opposite of what he taught about the educational developmental stages of a child, which are, if you look into that, it is so wrongheaded and was adopted by John Dewey, and then it just became what we now know of today as liberal education. That is the liberal education revolution, started with John Dewey, late 1800s, early 1900s, but he is very dependent on Rousseau's ideology. But Rousseau taught explicitly that a child is not to learn rote facts or any brute facts up until the age of 13. Instead, what they're to do is they're to be turned loose into their environment, and they're to just discover themselves. And as they get in touch with nature, their true nature grows naturally into this pure, moral, useful
So this is where
person.
I would say his philosophy
And
is,
the analogy he gives actually is the practice of parents at the time of swaddling children or babies tightly in swaddling blankets. And so he would say, do not do that. Do not put any parameters on Clementine or your children. Let that child reach out. Let that child scratch themselves if they want. Let that child scream and cry and do everything they can. Don't put any parameters on the child, because the child is trying to just discover its true, essentially good nature. Now, obviously, we think that's crazy talk. Like that doesn't make any sense at all. That you would do that. In addition to that, we now know beyond the peradventure of a doubt that character is set by the age of 4 or 5, and that essential principles that a person learns, in order for them to become a lifelong learner, they have to be set by the age of 13. And so he's advocating in his education system, do not begin to educate people in facts or anything that pertains to adulthood or adult life. Don't begin to do it until age 13, but that's when the Jews bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah their kids. That's when other traditions, that's when those traditions typically transitioned their children into adulthood, already having obtained the contents of their cultural tradition. So this is now just, this philosophy is not workable. It doesn't work. And it has been demonstrated over the 20th century to have failed, utterly failed.
Yeah.
How dare you, sir?
the education system within America. It's failed. So let's talk a little bit about romanticism.
Real quick.
Yeah, go
Patrick
ahead.
had something he wanted to.
Well, the untenable nature of the philosophy is that it prioritizes the individual. We agreed on that, but then it denies that other people are part of your environment.
Yeah.
So parents, other adults, it has to deny that because he sees them purely as an adversarial role. But you as a parent, we clearly would believe that we are a part of their environment, but he denies that is a natural thing.
Kind of built into it is a denial of other people's moral virtue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
To go with that.
How
irony
so?
of it.
What do you mean?
Yeah. So if society is comprised of individuals, and society begins to put boundaries, mores, customs that are a corrupting influence to the intrinsic moral nature of the noble savage born free into the world, the implication is you're denying that the other person is a morally virtuous being.
Yeah.
That so baked into the cake is not only are you deifying your own personality, you are denigrating and condemning everybody else who would give any input to that.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And this is one more thing. I was just going to tie it back to your original question of how can a doctor who, hears from somebody that they feel this way, and now they can be actually like prosecuted. I think this is the irony of the statement that Daniel was reading from 41. Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. In the last 300 years, right? So when he's writing that, he feels a societal pressure of like good and godly norms, customs, right? And just think of who is doing the chains now, right? Everything is flipped,
right?
Where we are the ones who, basically, if we don't conform, right? They're the ones like holding the chains, so to speak.
It is tyranny, actually.
Yeah.
It's a kind of an activism that is turned into a tyrannical philosophy of everyone must now conform to this philosophical viewpoint. What about romanticism? Why is romanticism? Why is that important? He mentions this kind of being the natural extension of Rousseau's philosophy, which is the widespread belief that just grants authority to feelings. That is to say, since our highest aim is to sort of realize or actualize ourselves as we get in touch with nature, that involves the inner voice revealed in human nature.
Yeah.
So how does his section on romanticism or the romantic philosophy following Rousseau?
Well, so Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Rousseau essentially transformed that and said, I feel, therefore it is.
Right.
And then the Romantics took that and they use the arrow and harp.
Yeah.
That's the image and picture, that you are strings in the wind, and once the wind blows over
And
you,
what is
you
that
will-
again? He mentioned
Well, it's
that.
a harp that would be placed. It's ancient version. Ancient. It's a couple centuries ago.
Yeah.
Version of wind chimes.
Yeah.
You would have strings, a harp outside, and as the wind blew over it, it would resonate in such a frequency and
I
produce
want one of
sound.
those. He
Man, it
described
sounds
that.
great.
I'm like, I want to
I
hang
think
one of
that's
those in
nice.
my backyard.
Just got to
But-
do a wind chime first.
Romantics pictured the world or every individual as that harp, and so we needed to involve ourselves and place ourselves in nature so that we can be we can resonate at our true frequency of who we are.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. Very well stated. Very well stated. So, what is the proper biblical role of feelings then? I mean, obviously, we want to have a biblical understanding of emotions and feelings because God made our emotional state.
Yeah.
So, how does the biblical world?
Yeah, Ryan, he made our emotional state.
I heard it clearly. I agree.
Is this a conversation you guys were having? Okay, so what is a biblical view then of the expression of the self, the expression of individual emotions?
Well, I think one of the things I've been noticing in rereading this, is that there are things that are true, that Rousseau got correct, Descartes got correct, that the other philosophers and theorists,
Half-truths.
right? Well, they're true, and then they take them and they make them the maximal truth,
Yeah.
by which all other truth is
Paradigm.
decided. And again, it's all centered interiorly. And so having an external standard by which to judge your emotions, to say, do these emotions comport with reality? Do they comport with God's will? That is the proper function of them, there to give color and life and they're to fill in the lines with texture and contrast and all that
Sure.
stuff. But they're to be within lines. They're to be within the lines that that the Lord has established, and having an external standard by which to judge that is crucial.
Sure. I think that what is the first commandment? Jesus was asked this question, what is the first commandment? What is it? And how does it relate to our emotional life? Well, it's the Shema. It's Deuteronomy 6:4-10. It's love the Lord your God with all that you are. Your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, everything. And in doing so, as you love the Lord your God with all of you are, you bring all that you are, including your emotional state, under the lordship of Jesus, right? And and you surrender that now to His word. But it doesn't mean you become an unemotional automaton. Like you just turn into this sort of religious robot.
They need to be subjective.
Is this an argument?
Ryan and I go round and round on this all the time.
Well,
what the role of
I
emotion
think feelings
is.
are so powerful. So take the Romantics. All they knew, they see in a dimly lit room. So that's what you're describing.
Yeah, that's
They
right.
see dim shadows and try to make sense of it all. But because emotions and feelings were so powerful, they had to come up with an explanation for why are they powerful. If they're that powerful, therefore they must be the most important. But backtrack that, and we look at the Christian worldview. Well, feelings are are super powerful, but they're extremely fickle.
Yeah.
They change. I seem to have no control over them.
They're
and they're
fallen.
purely reactionary. So we would then press into that and say, well, if that's the case, because of our view of total depravity, something needs to be of a higher and greater value.
Right.
Yeah.
And Paul establishes that in Romans, our thinking, our minds.
That's-
And that we see the cogs turn. It starts with our thoughts, then leads to our actions, followed by feelings. And you said it in a sermon yesterday.
Yeah.
If you don't feel it, first obey, and feelings will come second. We know that, but
Yeah.
we have special revelation that has lit the room to that understanding. So
Well,
I
that's
don't blame
excellent,
the
Pat.
Romantics.
That's a great. Everything you just said is exactly right. I think I don't even need to comment on it other than to say that's a very excellent way to put it and very succinct. I will just make one comment.
which is
Yes, if Paul's doctrine, I want to say not Calvin's, Paul's doctrine of total depravity, because Calvin got it from Paul. But if Paul's doctrine of total depravity, which I think he describes in Romans 1-3, is correct, then as James has said, the heart is corrupt. Just because I feel it doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it comports with my reality. I could be feeling something right now. I could be feeling angry at God for cancer, or for anything that has come to my doorstep. But that doesn't mean that my anger toward the Lord is justified. That's sin.
Yeah. So again, this is taking one of those components of truth and blowing it out, right? So you do see the heart is desperately wicked above all things. What happens 20 chapters later? I'm going to give you a new heart.
Amen.
I'm going to give you a new heart.
Amen.
Right. So there is an element of our emotions are sanctified in that.
Right.
Our emotion, we're given,
Being sanctified.
and our. But that's the question.
Paul says has
to
been
what
sanctified.
degree? Yeah. To what degree? You know, again, we get the discussion: are we sinners saved by grace, or are we redeemed saints who struggle with sin? You know, like to what degree is this? Is the Christian life a fundamentally stoic experience, or is it about living in redeemed emotion? You know, because and again, you can't live by emotion. Like that's not at all.
Sure.
Yeah.
But those things are given to give. I mean, I do things when I feel like doing them.
Right.
You know, I also do things when my mind tells me this must be accomplished and it's the right thing to do.
Well, as Pat was saying, it's obedience first, feelings follow. I did say that yesterday, didn't I?
You did.
It's like, man, I like that quote.
Man, I love that. Who did you get that from?
Hannah, we should put that
But
on
ultimately,
the
this
Instagram
goes back to
post.
page 41, that manners have no change. In order for me to feel properly, I must know the truth. Therefore, I'm dependent upon an external source to provide what that truth is. So baked into the cake of creation is dependency, and that was good. And so we get down the road of utter depravity, and independence is the God of the age.
Yeah.
I want to be a God unto myself, and so I have to throw off the shackles of dependency. But
Man,
it's good.
so good. You're nailing it today. You're on
good.
fire. Can I just say, I want to go back to something James said about total depravity, because I love talking about total depravity.
It's the new name of our podcast. We're
on the
call
one
it total depravity.
on the one hand, I
well exhibited.
want to agree with Calvin's definition in the Institutes. But on the other hand, I agree with his articulation of it in the Romans commentary. And I think all throughout the Romans series, I've been reading Calvin a lot, just along with whatever other scholars, Schreiner and the others, Douglas Moo, that I've been reading. But I want to say this. I think that it is true that there is what Calvin referred to as the sensus divinitas or sensus divinitatis. Forget which one of those it is. But there's a kind of image. That's what he meant by the image of God, residual image of God. And I want to say, yes, amen. Of course the Bible teaches that. Genesis chapter 9, God says, do not kill a human being because they are made in the image of God. Well, this is way past the fall, right? So yes. But at the same time, when you look back at the story of Noah, why did God bring that regional flood, that massive flood? The reason he did so is because every inclination of the heart had turned to sin. And I think there is a sense in which, without God giving us some restraint, and I would argue in the Ten Commandments, Moses is preached in all the cities, right? The proliferation of the Ten Commandments and some of the holiness codes in Leviticus, I would say, apart from God putting the brakes, externally just putting the brakes on human sin, we would just annihilate ourselves. We would extinguish ourselves. So I don't think that total depravity is just the idea that every human faculty is sufficiently corrupt. That's true. Of course that's true. But I think it's apart from a restraining. And then look at 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul says, there's going to come a time when this person called the man of lawlessness comes, right? And then there's this great, just to get into eschatology, because that's super fun. But then this great rebellion, this apostasy is going to happen. And then the one who restrains him currently is going to be taken away.
You don't think that was Claudius restraining Nero?
Very, very well could be. I'm just saying.
Just kidding.
Yeah, I think it is God. I think it is taking away a restraining the Holy Spirit's restraining influence in a culture, and now people are just allowed to fully realize their sinful self. I mean, and this is what you see in Revelation, actually.
Look what's happened in the 15 years since smartphones were introduced to society. So society looks nothing like what it did.
You're right.
It's been completely revolutionized towards, now there's some great things.
Yeah.
But has it been a net positive? I don't
Yeah.
In terms of the proliferation and accessibility of information, if you're judging it from that angle, sure. I mean, it's great to just literally take out your phone and look anything up and have facts. Like, we were watching a Dateline episode last night, and it was about some lady who had been killed, and the theory was there was an owl in a tree that attacked her at her front door and just scarred her head up, basically scalped her, and she died before she got help, and then they blamed the husband. So right then and there, I took out my cell phone. Carrie was like, "That's a stupid theory." And I said, "Carrie, did you know that 200 people a year die from owl
owl attacks? Well, there's another thing I got to live in fear of now.
Another phobia?" In other words, the point is that it's great to have access to just anything we want.
Yeah.
to
So
know.
this isn't a diatribe on technology. It's the what have we used technology for. So
Yes.
along with the proliferation of that information has come what? The proliferation of pornography.
Oh, yeah.
The underground. I mean, the black market
The dark
trade
web.
of drugs and people. I mean,
You're right.
We use these things.
Yeah.
And it enables, like, technology enables us to actually proliferate our wickedness.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So the question is, what is the restraining principle to human depravity that we see there leading up to Genesis 6, where they're just so depraved? I mean, they have to be wiped out. Every inclination of the mind, of the heart, is geared toward their own sin, such that God sees that the vast majority of these people are irredeemable, that he has to judge them, he has to wipe them out. I mean, that's pretty sad, with the exception of Noah and his family. But then also, so what is the limiting principle? And then what is the limiting force or the energy? I hate to use these terms, but what is really actually holding people back from fully realizing their most sinful impulses and desires?
The grace of God,
Grace of God.
both
Grace.
external and in form of their conscience.
But wouldn't you say the most tangible representation of that, though, is God's continual special revelation to his people? After Noah, we have Abraham being called
that's right.
out. We have him, the prophets continuing to come. We have his word. So a very tangible one, I would start there, that we have his people, constant relationship with him, that we potentially might be the force holding the world back at bay.
Yeah, I think
from
you're
sin's
right about
corruption.
that. Totally right about that.
I do think it can go beyond that, certainly.
Yeah.
But I would see us as.
So do you see that the existence, no matter how persecuted the church becomes in our nation or any nation, you see the church as being a restraint, an inherent restraint?
I can definitely see it. I know if you were to watch, and we've talked about this before, when Jordan Peterson talks about the Bible being the foundation of Western culture.
Yeah, it is.
Therefore,
Yep.
if that's the air Western culture breathes, no wonder we have a sense of morality, no matter where we go in the
Right.
Western world.
Right.
So yeah, that's a staying force.
Yeah, you're
in
right
some
about
way.
that.
But I
You're
also
right about
think when you have a redeemed community, it helps you to live outrightly, like from your emotions. Because when you're in a community of people, there are people who are able to say, "Oh, hey, brother, your anger in this is unrighteous.
Yeah,
Like this doesn't comport with the reality of the situation or the reality of God's will." Like, and so having a community like a church who are being renewed, who are in the process of actively engaging with that external thing that we need,
Yeah,
is a
that's
restraining
right.
force.
Yeah.
It is helpful.
And this is Truman's point in his conclusion, right? When he talks about Augustine and Justin Martyr talking about the church, Christians they should make the best citizens.
Yeah.
They should be the most moral. They should be contributing in a positive way to the culture, and they should be moral and promoting the law. And
Exactly.
things like that. So,
Well, yes, Christians are the best farmers. They're the best scientists.
Thank
They're
you.
the best artists. And the reason is
They're the
because
best looking and the funniest.
the believer, wherever he goes and whatever endeavor he engages, can sanctify that endeavor unto the Lord. We can have a sanctifying force. So
Well, I think this is part of the attack against the church. So on 40, he says, if society is the problem because it perverts and corrupts the individual, then society's institutions are the tool by which this is accomplished. I think that's one of the reasons why there's such an assault on the church, where the church has moved from an institution of trust and general favor. Part of the progress of this and the activism has been specifically to undermine the trustworthiness of the church. The church has done plenty of things to facilitate that distrust too. Like I'm not trying to say that we're innocent, but it's why there is a directed assault. And
but that's why we're reformed and reforming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Always reforming. We're not perfect. We're not totally sanctified yet until we're glorified. And so even though we fail our culture. I mean, we do stupid things. We revert back to our old nature and desire sinful things sometimes as the church. But the thing is that overall, I think we have a sanctifying presence in whatever culture we find ourselves. Absolutely. He raises the issue. So one issue is authority, authorizing. He uses the phrase authorizing the inner self, authorizing its feelings. And then he uses the word valorizing. Now, I think that those are two very interesting but different but related terms. It's one thing to say, I'm authorized, like I'm justified in defining myself according to my feelings. That's one thing.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say, now let's make this a valorizing aspect of our culture. Let's ennoble the person.
Let's reshape it in our image.
Yes. Any thoughts on that and the fact that you see in our culture today, you've got several, there are several expressions or manifestations of this, one of them being the noble victim. The noble victim, you've got the noble self, the noble individual, and the noble self-authority, and all this kind of stuff. What is your reaction to the idea that we are not just authorizing it, we're valorizing it? This has now become a virtue.
Yeah, I think that's the natural outworking of what I was trying to say earlier. Probably not well, though, of just the reversal of those man is free everywhere, but the chains, right? The natural outworking of that is those that disagree, start pushing back against culture. That can't be valorized. That can't be approved, right? And so we have to embrace it, or we are bigoted and throw whatever adjective you want in there.
Sure, yeah.
But I think all of this fundamentally comes back down to, the authorizing, the valorizing, all of it comes down to, and really all of this entire book is a fundamental disregard for the creator-creature distinction.
Yeah.
Where we, as the creature, want to do everything that the creator wants or is allowed to do, right? Is tying it back to the garden, right? But whenever you don't have that distinction in your mind at all of these things will come.
Yeah. But aren't we image bearers, though? Aren't we supposed to be imitators
and we are,
of God?
right?
Ephesians 5:1.
Yeah, we are. But that's exactly right. We imitate the creator by acknowledging that he's the creator.
Yeah.
And whenever that doesn't happen, we look to ourselves to be the true creator, and we tie everything authority, valorizing back to that. So that's why even when you were saying earlier, Christians are the best scientists, Christians are the best artists. Well, there's brilliant people out there that aren't Christians, right? We acknowledge that.
Of course,
but the reason that they're the best is because they have the creator-creature distinction down, and they're doing all of those things under a right understanding of who God is, what he's done, and how we fit properly into society.
Yeah. Boy, well said. That's very well said. Shifting to some questions here, are we saying that it is always wrong to express our individuality?
I thought he was going to say emotion. I was going to say yeah.
So if the problem is my highest authority is myself, my most valorous, ennobled expression is the manifestation of my true self, whatever I think my nature is according to my feelings. What is a biblical view of individuality? Do we have one? Or are we just a collective? I brought this up a couple of Sundays ago, just a pop quiz.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I think proper individuality is still affirming that I am one piece of a greater whole.
Yeah.
And that's first in connection with the Lord. I'm His image bearer. But then two, my environment is around other individuals, but we piece together. We are united as creatures. If
And
I
I
can use right language.
And I think it is self-actualization, self-discovery in obedience and in relationship to the Creator. Because it's interesting. One of the questions, what's the first question, or what the second question that God asks Adam? Who told you you were naked? Right? Clearly, there was this element of ungodly self-discovery there. But you know, I don't think that God was trying to restrict all knowledge. I think He was trying to lay knowledge in at appropriate times and in appropriate ways.
Sure.
And all of a sudden, you see, He's discovered this thing that is outside of the appropriate relationship with God. And so I do think we were created for self-discovery and self-actualization. That's part of it's part of God's good design in us, but it was to be done in relationship to the Creator and its mission.
Such a great insight, Daniel. That's a great insight, and that just reminded me that he realized before he ever sinned that he didn't have a suitable partner, which was also part of his self-discovery. And he did that quite naturally. God didn't tell him, hey, you don't have a suitable partner, just hang in there. He just came to realize everyone else has a match, but I don't. And I think you're right about that. I think there's nothing inherently irreligious or unspiritual about self-discovery. And this goes back to Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12 now, where Paul says we are individually members of one another.
Yeah.
And so our individuality is partially defined
by how God has blessed us.
By how God has blessed us.
Right. And
individually.
what He's gifted us. And then defined in how we, I think, in terms, serve the church, serve the others with that gifting.
That's right. Because He's given us that individuality now to contribute to the whole.
Yeah.
And this is why fundamentally I think the Descartes, Rousseau romanticism, as it has come into the John Dewey educational philosophy from the early 20th century, is so pernicious. And I would say it's so pernicious because now what essentially what it has done is that it has enabled the culture to create individuals who are their own little cultural capsule. In other words, individuality has become an end in of itself, right? Instead of the individual learning the contents and substance of their culture by learning these things, in elementary school. Yeah. And now everyone is so radically individualized that it is the total fragmentation of a culture.
Yeah.
And
but
I
we
think
would
that's
consider
how,
that culture nature. But the Romantics don't, and that's why they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
Culture is part of our nature. It shapes and it forms me.
Yeah.
I am who I am because that wind of culture in the church blows over and I resonate, if I can use that image and picture.
Yeah.
But they just want to deny this subset and say, no, that doesn't count.
Well, you're right about that. I mean, the individual and the collective, if I could use Star Trek terminology just for a second. But the individual and the group, they have a mutually interpreting relationship. The group can't function without the individuals enabled and empowered to do what individuals do, just like a body and your body parts. Yeah. That's why that's such a brilliant analogy.
It's a holy codependence, right?
Yeah.
It's a God-intended codependence.
Interdependence.
Interdependence.
Yeah. I think it's probably a better word there.
Probably.
Well, Trueman talks about it on 41. He says we should note one another implication of this, talking about Rousseau's philosophy. If the original pristine individual is the truly authentic me, that not just institutions, but every other person stands in a naturally adversarial relationship to me.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone else is first and foremost a potential threat to my authenticity.
Yeah.
And the question that I wrote there was, what does this do to a society?
Oh, yeah.
Like, what does this do to the concept of we are, the citizens of,
I think we see,
we are a church, we are a,
Yeah.
what it immediately fragments it.
Yes.
Destroys it.
What
Does
are
it
the
at the family
statistics?
level? It does it at the
Right.
the township and state
Yeah.
and
But how do you see it in American culture today? How has that you just read
what I was gonna go.
manifested in the tribalism
Yeah.
of groups and constituencies constantly at war? I mean, how? Obviously, we see that manifest in our society, right?
Well, you see people who, I only partner with those who give me unconditional affirmation,
Right.
who are self-confessed, no threat to my authentic self.
Good way to put it.
Yeah. And even potential threats, right? If you don't embrace my understanding of myself and I can see you over there doing something, even though it might not be bothering me, that still has to be taken down, right?
Yeah.
You
But
see it- you see it
inevitably,
with businesses, and everything like that.
even within those tribes, someone's going to offend me over something.
Yeah.
So I think it ultimately leads
And
to
then they get
isolation and
slaughtered.
pure loneliness.
Slaughtered on the altar of cancel culture.
Well,
Yeah.
But is it true
Yeah,
that
sure.
statistically that our culture is more lonely today than it's ever been?
it
Totally.
is, even though we have the proliferation of what we call social media.
Yeah.
It's not social at all. It's not socialable.
Yeah.
It doesn't foster koinonia. It doesn't foster fellowship. It fosters, especially that cesspool called Twitter, right? That ideological cesspool called Twitter
Yeah.
that Ryan literally sends me every day.
I send you encouraging things.
Yeah. I don't think there's
He finds
anything
the one
encouraging on it.
I find the one tweet.
You find the one tweet in
Oh,
the
look, I found a diamond in the
in an
sewer.
ocean of
I
sewage.
find a good piece of pizza.
But here's the problem. How is the self-reflection of Rousseau and Romanticism different than we find in Psalms and Paul? So he mentions Psalms and Paul. Pastor.
Well, I mean, it goes back to that when we were talking about total depravity and the list of faculties that have been corrupt. I mean, that list is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Those faculties have all been corrupted by sin. And so when we have emotions, just like David does in the Psalms, I mean, the Psalms contain every emotion that we could ever feel. You know, I remember praying Psalms 13, how long, O Lord, how long will you forget me forever?
Right.
And then at the end, but I have trusted in your steadfast love.
Yeah.
It's the reality that we take our emotions to the Lord with their raw tangibility, and we say, Lord, I'm here. Here it is. Here's how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And then the word of God, as Jesus prays for us in John 17, sanctify them with your word, right? And we're
Yeah.
sanctified by the word, and that's the purification. And then we come, hopefully, through those emotions to a solid standing before God of saying, but
Right.
you are good. You are my Father.
Right.
You are for me. You are with me in any circumstance.
And isn't that how the self-reflection of the psalmist always ends up?
right.
No matter what he's expressing in terms of his raw emotions to
Right.
God, feeling abandonment, like you said. So many psalms that talk about feeling abandonment or feeling even just depression or anxiety or whatever the emotions are there. They end in, but God, you are good, and I know you have
Right.
a
Yeah.
plan, and
Yeah.
I trust in you.
They bring their emotions to the truth.
and
Right.
submit
To the
them
truth.
to
But even
the
if they
God
don't, there's
who is
two
truth.
Psalms, Psalm 88 and 89, which don't come to that conclusion. It leaves it open-ended. And so there's something to me, the reason why that's included in the Psalms is because there will be moments in life where there is no immediate conclusion or I don't have access to it. But the psalmist never comes to a point of blaming, arguing with, but they do come to a place where I need to mentally assent to this is what God has for me.
And
But that's
it's
what
clear
isn't that
wrestling
what
with
Job
it.
does? Isn't that the
Yes.
lesson of the book of Job?
Yeah. Right.
I
Who
mean,
are
we
you, O
get
man?
to the end of that book and realize God's answer is, "I'm God."
Yeah.
Why did this happen
And
to me?
but it's
Because
clear
I'm
that
God.
it's clear that both Job and the psalmist are processing it in the context of there being a creator.
Yeah.
They're
Yes.
processing it with the Lord. They're trying to reconcile to an external thing. They're
Right.
trying to reconcile.
Yeah.
Okay, you've told me you're good, and yet here's my family slaughtered.
Mhm.
You know, like,
Yeah.
and so
Right.
the processing of emotions in the context of doing it with the Lord, like it's
Yeah.
one of the
Mhm.
it's one of the things that we tell people is be sad, but be sad with the Lord.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, like
Right.
don't hide these things or try to block them off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're right concerning 88 and 89, and they end. I think that's important to just allowing all of Scripture to inform us, not just having 88 and 89.
Yeah.
Right? They end Book 3 of the Psalms. Book 4 of the Psalms opened up. Lord, you have been our refuge in every generation. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
it's,
it is fitting.
it's not
Mhm.
ultimately ending there, but I know what you're saying too.
Yeah. That's
So
Well,
I
I
have a-
think it's powerful that in Jesus on the road to Emmaus gives us a good insight that rather than solving those two men's road to Emmaus, their problem and their hurt and their pain and their suffering of his death, he could have just revealed himself and they would have been fine. Instead, he asked the question, what things? There's a priority of him joining us in those difficult sufferings,
Mhm.
tension.
And then they excoriate him for not knowing. I'm like, are you the only person in Jerusalem
who
who?
do not know.
Idiot.
But then he says, what things? Tell me about them. But he could have solved it by just revealing himself.
That's a really good passage. I think that's illustrative use of the passage. But that's a really good illustration of how just Jesus gives them a little time to process. He gives them a little time to pour out their heart before, and he doesn't reveal himself until he gets to the hotel,
yeah.
and or the inn, and they're sitting over dinner, and then he disappears, and
they run back.
they're like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, that was Jesus!" And so good.
So I think there's a tendency to make Christianity a stoic endeavor.
Yeah,
And I don't think that is correct. I think that God does care about our emotion and has layered it into us. I have a question about this.
To be
Hold on,
fair,
I
I
wanna
think
ask
the
you, what do
tendency
you
is just
mean?
on the flip side as well.
it
Oh,
can
you know
be.
what I mean?
It
No,
can
to
be.
make
So-
it pure romanticism.
Yeah.
Well,
And I think there's a
emotional
balance.
binging
Yeah.
is not biblical
There's a healthy
either.
middle. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what do you mean by stoicism?
The idea of we are to actually subdue our emotion.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That we're not to experience
Suppress it.
We're to order our lives in such a fashion that it actually functions to it's the British stiff upper lip thing of like, hey, don't talk about this. don't,
Swallow it.
Yeah.
Or Japanese, in Japanese culture where they just listen, swallow it,
Yeah.
push it down, don't express
That's a response
it.
of a zero-sum game because we can't trust it, therefore we can't have it, and that's not true.
Yeah.
It needs
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
sanctified. It needs to be
Well, I
brought
think those are
under.
two extremes, though. I think one is we want to avoid emotional binging, which I think you see in a lot of churches today, where it's just the worship services are incomprehensible to me. Even as a former charismatic, I just think the hour that we just spent chanting mantras and giving expression to any emotion that surfaces in the heart seems patently unbiblical. But then on the other side of it, we shout unto God,
Yeah.
rejoice in the Lord. You have these powerful passages in the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms, that command us to shout to God with the voice of triumph, which we don't do very much in our culture today. It's very sad that we don't. But the spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets.
Explain that.
Well, I think what Paul is trying to say there to the Corinthians when he says that to them is remind them, this isn't the New Testament expression of your worship or preaching or anointed preaching or whatever it is not out of your control.
Yeah.
It's always under your control. And so stay in control. Right?
Yeah.
So there's that element as well. I want to read you actually from a book that I want to encourage all of our listeners to get, and all of you as well. It was written some years ago, and it's been updated variously by E.D. Hirsch Jr., and it's called Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. Hirsch wrote this book. This is a scathing critique. He wrote it originally in the 80s, but it's a scathing critique on the Rousseau, John Dewey, and the cardinal principles, what's called the cardinal principles educational theory, which took over American education and actually institutionalized the things we've been talking about in the American educational system, right? And so essentially, in this book, he's pushing back on this to say, nope, individuals are educated with facts and knowledge about their culture first. And when they do that, their individuality can then make a contribution to that culture, but you got to decide what your culture is, right? And this is what he says. Children can express individuality only in relation to the traditions of their society, which they have to learn. The greatest human individuality is developed in response to a tradition, not in response to disorderly, uncertain, and fragmented education. Americans in their teens and 20s who were brought up under the individualistic theories, these individualistic theories, are not less conventional than their predecessors, only less literate, less able to express their individuality. In other words, the very thing that they're taught to do in this educational system, where they're taught to discover who they are, who their real nature is according to their own feelings and desires, and then to express that individuality as an end in of itself, is actually counterproductive. It doesn't achieve the thing that they're being taught it can achieve. It's only the expression of that individuality within a tradition, within a society that has a defined culture, right? And this is why the Judeo-Christian Western culture is so important for us to preserve. It's so important for us to maintain it and to fight for it, because that tells them, as you were saying last week, there's a bigger story. There's a higher story. And that story tells us individually who and what we are. Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Good.
I'm going to keep thinking about it. No, I agree.
Okay,
I just need to keep thinking about it.
Right on. Okay, any other insights from this particular chapter? It was pretty short. Next chapter will be pretty big.
I want to hear Daniel's question.
Oh, you know what? I don't know if we're going to have... I think
we don't have time.
We'll be good to circle around to it.
Okay.
So it's regarding music.
All right.
It's regarding the fact that music is the only thing that I can conceptualize that moves emotion apart from thought. That there is an experience of music that actually functions to... So it's a question. I'll formulate it and ask it better next time.
Oh, man, I can't wait to talk to that.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, send it to us beforehand. We could think through it a little bit, and that's great. That's a great idea. Okay, anything else you want to share, any insights you had? Josh. We left you in the dust. Give us your thoughts on this chapter and any insights.
Yeah, no, I was just happy to listen to you guys. That was awesome. I mean, I can't really think of anything that you guys didn't cover that I would have said, but yeah, I thought it was just fantastic. It was a super accurate diagnosis of society nowadays, especially my generation. I just like seeing everything, all the cesspools, Twitter, Instagram.
Oh yeah,
just watching everything that we're posting and sharing now.
Yeah.
So
I think our only hope at this point would be a comet to hit our satellite.
He means revival. That's what he was.
No, a great awakening. Yeah. That would be. But God uses means, brother.
That's true. Touche.
That might be the thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we're done. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Good to see you guys again.
See you guys.
Bye.